despite how fast I talk, apparently we're not able to fit everything into one video. So this is a continuation of the previous section where we will now focus on PowerPivot integration with Excel services. So I believe there are other talks on PowerPivot for Excel, but what ends up, the output of this is I have an XLSX file, which is really, if you look at it, is a zip file. And somewhere embedded in the file format is what is essentially an ABF. You can just think of it, ABF is our backup file format. So you can think of somewhere embedded in the parts of the XLSX is an ABF, and that our system, when given an XLSX, knows how to find the ABF and retrieve it and interact with it out. So I've built one of these using the PowerPivot for Excel add-in. I've created this XLSX. It has an ABF embedded in it. I've uploaded it to SharePoint. Not walking back to there. I've got it open. I'm viewing it in the browser, and now I say I want to interact. I want to actually click on a slicer or expand out some level in the pivot table. When that happens, just like any other data source, we are a data source. Our OLADB provider is typically called MS-OLAP, and to Excel services they would say, oh, I need to issue this MDX query to get more data so that I can figure out what I'm supposed to display. Let me open a connection via MS-OLAP and let me send this query. So let's go back over what we had just talked about a second ago, where the user is authenticated to here. I have a claims token that flows to here, and then I have a claims to Windows token service running on my machine that this guy interacts with on a call essentially to get token. So the connection, and there is a physical connection, you can actually open up a file called connections.xml, which is embedded in the zip file. And in there you will find a connection whose data source is listed as $embedded. And if you open this up in the Excel client, you can go to Connections, after you build this workbook, go to Connections, and you'll see it. And if you go to the advanced properties for the Excel authentication, you will see we check Windows. So, I'm probably going a little bit fast, but we talked about a second ago that to do Windows, we require, typical Excel would require Kerberos constrained delegation, or you can't actually flow a valid Windows token. You can't make the hop off the machine to some SQL server on a different machine or an Oracle database. Our world, though, we allow Windows because we are part of the SharePoint world, and we are actually able to understand claims tokens and use the SharePoint STS to generate a claims token even within MS-OLAP. So what ends up happening is in MS-OLAP, the call comes in and we recognize, oh, the call is $embedded $. And along with this, there's an interface on the OLADB provider where Excel services says, they're essentially telling us that we're in a hosted mode. So this MS-OLAP provider is the same MS-OLAP provider that would be invoked if I was in the Excel client, opening up my workbook and clicking on slicers. So the fact that we work differently here and here, there had to be a way that we knew. And Excel services actually tells us we're in a hosted environment. The implication is don't load this embedded ABF into their process space. We want to load it on a separate server, a potentially separate server, and a separate service, which is actually a full-blown analysis services engine, sort of the classic way you think of our server, where we can do things like share. If multiple people are opening the same workbook, we can only load it once. We can do things like cache the extracted ABF locally on disk in a format that is easier for analysis services to quickly load. We can do a lot of other things that are in different pictures, but this is the key. There is a way we are able to detect and have a handshake with our caller that says, don't load me in process. So when MSOLAP gets this call, it says, oh, it's dollar embedded, oh, and we're in a hosted environment, so we don't want to load anything. What we're going to say is, this is the best way. MSOLAP at its lowest level has 4 transport. We have a TCP, we have an HTTP, we have a local, and we have what we call a channel. This is new. So this is, connect to AS, just regular connect. This classically is MSMD pump. MSMD pump. This classically was used for cub files. And this is a new component we have written so that just as here there is a WCF binding that's used, we are able to configure and interact with WCF in a managed world. We actually make a hop back out into the managed world and say, all right, let's interact directly with a back-end web service that is fronting analysis services. And this is a physical NT service. And this is actually a web service. And across this, we flow claims. So we take that user, Excel called into the claims to Windows token service, got a limited user token. The limited user token is enough for us to regenerate the same set of claims that have been flowing through this level. We regenerate them. Our binding does the same issued token over transport. Over transport. We flow it across, and at this point we are able to do things like validate that you had access to the file and trace information about you and forward you to the appropriate analysis services server. That might mean we have to load it. It might have already, the database may have already been loaded, and in a multi-machine scenario we might pick any one of n machines based on either round robin or health-based choices. Just as a note, this local transport that I mentioned here, previously used for cut files, that's the same thing that's used here. In the Excel only world, it'll use local, which essentially loads the ABF file in process. So we can use this for in process, and this is what we're using for embedded, where we want to actually go out of process. So that is the quick way in which you can understand why we don't require Kerberos constrained delegation, even though we are a separate data source. And typically any data source that ECS uses that is marked as Windows requires Kerberos. Now, there are a couple interesting things to note about all this. One, as I mentioned before, is that C2WTS actually is going to try and make a call somewhere around and go to AD. If your machine is off the network, we can't talk to Active Directory. I believe there's been another talk on one of the alternatives being actually configuring Active Directory like on the same machine. So you can do that, but just know that Claims to Windows token service, even though we're not trying to use Kerberos constrained delegation, will try and talk to AD, even just to get a limited token. Another thing to note is that I mentioned before that while this, we typically think of as doing Windows NTLM authentication, you might be doing forms-based auth, and technically you can do claims auth. If you do either of these, this doesn't work. There is no converting a forms-based auth user to a Windows user. You can't do it. At that point, this becomes a non-option. So if you've actually configured forms-based auth, and we have some things that don't exactly work with forms-based auth, but this scenario can work if you change this to either none or SSO. It'll affect some of our ability to track information. So when all of this flow is happening, we're actually tracking the fact that user X did something. And within analysis services, we do what is effectively setting the effective user, which is a classic AS term, so that in SQL Profiler and stuff like that, when you see who's interacting, you'll see this user. If this user is authenticating using one of these methods, we won't be able to flow that. So if you use none or SSO, you can get through, but you'll lose a little bit of information. But you can actually get things functionally working. So those are two important things to understand for different topology configurations.